Hello, I'm Max Whitehead, and I'm here to tell you about the dramatic changes that are about to happen to employment law. There are 6 pieces of legislation waiting to go through Parliament right now. Some of them are not draft, some of them are draft, and some are about just to go through. So it's pretty exciting times in terms of employment law, and the dramatic changes are going to affect everybody in employment, employers and employees. And I would put it to you that perhaps the unions will be rather ecstatic with the changes that are coming. They certainly reflecting on terms of what they're looking for. Employees will be happy. There'll be substantive increases coming for many of those employees. And of course, employers will not be happy because their costs are going to rise. And according to the cost of goods will have to go up. And it'll, for smaller employers, is going to be quite a difficult period of time. Okay, let's have a quick look at what topics we're going to be talking about. The first one is a holiday pay calculation, and that's going to have a radical change. So the Holidays Act's up for review. That's probably going to happen end of this year, if not into next year. That will happen, and badly needed too. Mandatory pay rates. There's a new regime coming out called Fair Pay. Question is, who's it fair to, employees or employers? But they're calling it balanced. Well, I've got to say, on different perspectives. So that piece of legislation hasn't been drafted, but I believe it's getting drafted as we speak. So a lot of things are going to happen there. Equal employment, there is an act in place, been around since the 70s. That's been revamped, and the new bill, there was a bill put out by the National Party. Jacinda threw that out when she got into power, and she's rehashed it, and there's another bill just released last week. So a lot of factors in that, and that will affect employment quite dramatically, and pay rates for certain areas, but I'll tell you more about that later. There are amendments to the Employment Relations Act which will increase union power dramatically. There are other changes in it, the well-known one about the 90-day trial period, but we'll come into that a little bit more later, and we'll tell you a bit more about it. There's another piece of legislation called the Triangular Employment Bill, which is actually out, drafted, and going through Parliament as we speak, through its readings. Could take quite a while. So that's been released, and submissions have already been accepted for it. What that is where there are temp agencies involved with the engagement of staff in a workplace. Now, a lot of factors are employers have been dodging employment law because it's getting harder and harder, and about to get even more harder, and engaging contractors. Well, the Labor Party have indicated, this is our new government, that they're going to introduce a bill about dependent contractors. What does that mean? So if a contractor is dependent on the employer, then there are going to be a minimum employment rights for contractors. Yes, that will be shocking a few of you. And those people in your workplace now, you're going to be in for having to treat them a lot differently. So there's 6 pieces of legislation coming up. Let me go into them in a lot more detail. First off, let's talk about the Holidays Act, the variations to that. Now, why review? Well, that act's been around for a long, long time. And it contemplates that the workplace is a 9 to 5, Friday to Monday to Friday regime. So and that's what it was like in the old days. Whereas upon a huge proportion of our workforce now don't work any hours like that. In fact, I think it's not many people work hours like that anymore. Salaried employees are doing more than 40-hour week. So, but that's what the act, the Holidays Act's been built on, and it's caused a lot of dramatics and a lot of problems. Because our workforce is becoming more casualised, more temporary. People are preferring to work temporary jobs rather than being committed to having to go to work every day of the week. Employers are loving it too, particularly small employers. It takes the peaks and troughs out of their business, so it works for them. The other factor is systemizing it. In other words, automating pay systems and whatever is very, very difficult because the act is difficult. The current act is very difficult to interpret. So there is some issues in that regards. Also, today we see a lot of people incentivized to go to work. They paid a commission, overtime, variable pays. People's pays are very lumpy these days in accordance with their performance or when they're attending. And the Holidays Act makes that very difficult to calculate. What is a holiday? What is a week's holiday for some of those people? And of course, the big one is where MIMBY, the police person, the guardian of all these legislations, have actually been calculating the holiday pay wrong all these years. and have there's been quite a large amount of publicity on the fact they've got it wrong. But it's not only them; many other organisations have. So there's a lot of changes afoot, and a lot of changes needed. So that's why we need some changes. Now, why have we got these problems? Well, there's a lack of specific prescription in the Act. It's a lot of generalities, which leaves it to the parties or the courts to decide. And I'm very much against that, whereupon the courts could take 2 years to decide on the definition of a word even. And that causes all sorts of difficulties for employers and employees to know what they're entitled to. The Act is very complex and it's difficult to interpret, and many people having a different go, and of course that causes ambiguity and arguments and all sorts of difficulties. It lacks clarity and guidance. The definition of a week is not clear, and that causes difficulty. As I say, the holidays are allocated in a weeks and paid in weeks, whereupon a lot of workers today, work various shifts and work different hours and work weekends and nights, and those sort of things makes it very difficult. The other big problem, which is, I think it's ridiculous, in the Act itself, there's 4 different calculations. And when you're calculating holiday pay, you have the ordinary pay, the average pay, the relevant daily pay, or the average daily pay. These things cause a lot of difficulties, and which one do you use and when those factors come about. Of course, the Holidays Act has a lot more in it than just holidays. It's got sick pay. It deals with people that are having bereavement leave. Those factors are dealt with in the Holidays Act as well. So what are the pays for that? Public holidays, when a person has a day off in lieu, those factors all cause complexities. So there's a lot of sorting out to be done in that regard, and that's why we've currently got a massive amount of problems around holiday pay. And a lot of people, I would think, are not even aware, a lot of workers out there not even aware that they've been underpaid or overpaid, and a lot of employers would have no idea, because part of the automatic systems that have been put in place have really not taken that into consideration. Anyway, the government have signalled what their objectives are in terms of when they do review the pay. So they're looking at retaining all the current rights for employees. So the holiday pay, sick pay, bereavement leave, all that will be retained. No reason for panic there from the unions or anyone like that. They're also going to declare they're going to try and put clarity and certainty into it. It's a challenge because there's so many variations of different types of employment these days. It is a real challenge, but it needs to be addressed. So hopefully they can get clarity and certainty. And minimising of compliance costs. Small employers particularly suffer here. The costs of calculating going back. There was a decision recently, I think it was Wendy's Hamburgers, where the courts insisted, it was the Employment Authority, I believe, that they go back 6 years and recalculate everybody's pay on the basis of what they'd done in terms of overtime and things like this. It is very difficult, and of course that's one heck of a job for those guys with tens of thousands of employees. Now the other thing is balanced decision making. Now again, that's from what perspective do you look at it? Who's balanced? So and the other thing is a big signal there to employers: be wary. Currently, right now, if an employee wants to have a holiday, they seek permission of the employer, and if there's agreement, off they go. If there's not an agreement, who gets the final say? Employers do. I wouldn't mind betting that's going to change. And the employees may be able to take holidays when they wish to. So we're up for a little bit of uncertainty there, but there's a strong signal that's probably what's going to happen. Future-proofing, well, that's all legislation should be done into that. Simplicity, and hopefully that is. And there is, it's going to be difficult, simplicity in terms of calculations and people's rights. Payroll systems, and as I mentioned before, MIMBY got it wrong. Many other big employers got it wrong. The software writers got it wrong. And I've got to say, it wasn't a hard matter to work out. Is it the average pay, the ordinary pay? Anyway, I won't get into the details. But where it's going to affect a lot of pay packets eventually. And so is a whole new regime, and a whole lot of software is going to have to be drafted. So what they're saying is make it simple for the software writers. And I think that's sensible. The protection of employees' entitlements. Well, I think that goes without saying, and that's probably what this government's sole purpose is. Being a Labor government, that's the, mind you, Mr. Peters has got, by the sound of it, the power of veto, so we might see some changes in terms of what they're wanting, but certainly this Labor government are funded, supported by unions, and that's where it's driven from, to go out of the way to support workers. Okay, moving on to the next one. The likely changes, I think we're going to find the calculations are going to be standardised. Thank goodness we get rid of those 4 different types of calculations and simplified. Protection of employees' entitlements, again, that's understandable, taking this government, which is in place. And maybe employers are going to have to take some compromises here, but we'll yet to see. And we'll probably know more about that by getting near the end of the year. Accommodation of flexible hours, it's got to do that. It's just got to. Currently, right now, I think our politicians only see 8 to 5 because that's what happens in Parliament. Well, actually, probably doesn't, though. A lot of those salary people don't. But what I'm saying is they don't see the small employers. And that the small employers are 97% of all organisations in New Zealand. 97% of organisations who have less than 20 staff, they are small to medium employers. So unfortunately, the government has the impression, well, they're showing some change here, that all employers are big fat cats and have hundreds of staff. Well, it's not the case. The majority of them don't. And they're employing over 50% of our workers in our society. But look, this is a move in the right direction. I'm very much in favour of the review, and it's good news. Clarity and simplification. Well, it's hopefully that gets there. Now, this next one, fair pay, mandatory minimum pay. Now, that's quite concerning. This is something that was around way back in the 70s and 80s. There was legislation around those days, and there used to be awards. Awards were set for industries or particularly occupations, and the parties, the unions and the employers would select a group of people who would go off and sit in a room and argue and fight over what would end up being the pay rate for, not only pay rates, terms and conditions, but pay rates primarily is what it's about. And that would set the regime for everybody who was covered by those certain awards. Now, this government are going to take us back to that. Now, what I'm thinking, there was quite a few awards in those old days. I think today there's going to be a lot less. So this definitely going to go ahead. I mean, it's favouring what the unions want, and that is to have an easier life. It means that they can negotiate pay rates to cover all New Zealand. One pay rate for engineers, for good examples, clerical workers, whatever it may be, one regime. This is the principle of it, and that'll set the minimum rates. That means if the employer wants to be generous, he can increase it. But however, that'll be the minimum. And of course, I don't know, people from the older days will remember perhaps some of the major strikes that went in to get certain awards higher, where whole industries would perhaps go on strike. This government have already said when we're doing this bill, when it comes out, there'll be no strikes during the negotiations. So be relieved of that. But it doesn't take long to get to deadlock. I've been involved with many collective negotiations, and to get to deadlock doesn't take very long at all. I mean, parties having a good approach to it and compromise, it's easy, but there's a lot of passion, a lot of people floating around, and representatives have to go back out and sell whatever they've compromised to the worker. It takes time, a lot of communication issues, and it can be quite difficult and arduous, and there's a lot of passion. We've seen striking and people protesting in the streets. The nurses was recently, teachers are about to do it. It's just, we are doing it. We're going to see a lot more of that. And of course, who's going to be at the top of the pile? And that's the union movement. So many, many workers or employees out there who are not covered by unions will eventually be covered by unions because of this, because their minimum pay will be dictated to by those particular documents that are negotiated. What's the purpose? One, to increase wages. This government's promised it, and man, they're going to do it. This will do it. There's a thing called ratcheting as well, because one industry will look at another. So, for example, you get some wealthy workers might want a 10% increase, for example, or some underpaid people want a 10% increase. It's likely that the other industries say, we need a 10%. However, their pay is already at a reasonable rate. And then there's the arguments go backwards and forwards. But what does happen over time is ratcheting. One gets higher, the other gets higher. One gets higher, the other gets higher. My view is it might take 10 years or maybe less these days because things happen a lot quicker. We're going to see quite significant increases in rates of pay. Now, again, as I'm saying, the unions will negotiate it on behalf of workers, and there will have to be selected employers who are going to be representing their workers. So people in my role, for example, may be requested by a group of employers to go in and negotiate on their behalf. It's likely that a lot of employees covered in certain industries and certain jobs will have no choice. It's not definite yet, but it's likely that they'll have no choice but to be covered by those minimum rates of pay and by the union's negotiations. Yeah, so I think you're going to find union membership's going to skyrocket. Union influence in our society is going to increase dramatically, and that's exactly what they wanted, and that's what they voted for, to get the Labour Party in, although they did get the less majority, but that's another story. So if they reach deadlock, striking can occur after that. So during negotiations, there'll be no striking. Great. But then after deadlock, I think you're going to find there'll be striking. So it's going to be difficult. We may see petrol rationing again or whatever might happen again. But let's wait and see, because there's been a huge increase, even without this piece of law, in certainly industrial action we've seen in the last 6 months. Likely contractors are going to get the same. So what we're seeing is it's a possibility they may even put in there for fair pay that contractors be paid the same doing the same work. So brace yourself for that, employers, because I know you take advantage of contractors out there to get work done at a cheaper rate of pay, sometimes, not always. So that may change quite quickly. So that's quite a lot to come up. Now, I've invented this word. It's the pay envy revolution. Yes, well, that one before I mentioned before, people will be comparing their rate of pay or the increase they've had to other groups and across New Zealand. For example, the clerical workers across New Zealand had a 5% increase. We want the same. That's what we're going to see. So pay envy. People will be looking over their shoulder all the time. Now, under the Equal Pay Amendment Bill, which has just been released, there's two parts to that. One is where females who in whole industries can now challenge their pay rates. We saw that with the rest home workers. But there's a second part to this piece of law as well, whereas workers can say, hey, Jack across the road does the same job as me for a different company, but he's getting paid more than me. I want the same pay. And they can take it with this piece of law, challenge the employer, take it to the judiciary and get an order in their favour. If they got to take it through all the way, but this is what this piece of law is. That's why I call it the pay envy revolution, or earnings envy revolution. So everyone's earnings, people are going to be looking over to see if anyone's getting paid anymore, because then they've got rights to bring them up. Will ratcheting happen again? Leave it to you. But that's under the Equal Pay Amendment Bill. And of course, the second part is quite large in our society, is where women in industries that are predominantly women in an industry will be able to seek an increase with another industry that will be, ran predominantly by men. So, for example, I believe this is a case in UK. Rest home workers were compared to prison guards, and their pay was adjusted accordingly. And so they then would have rights to put a claim in for that. Now, this legislation would allow similar comparisons. My concern is most of these women occupations, teachers, rest home workers, those sort of nurses, these things really, the government have got control over the pay of those things. So why don't they adjust them if they needed to rise? And they do need to be raised up. But why enter legislation that gets the parties into conflict if the government do have control of that already? Anyway, that's just my thoughts, and maybe you disagree entirely. But we're going to see quite a lot of... two things are going to happen. I think we could see a bit of industrial action, not so much on this bill, but the other previous ones I've talked about. But we're certainly going to see a lot of activity in the judiciary. Yes, a lot of court cases. I think the government are going to have to boost up enormously, and it's already needed in their judiciary because it's under-resourced already. And man, there's a lot of legislation coming up now. It's going to adjust that. 6 pieces. So, and what is frightening for some employers is that the judiciary will be empowered to order pay rises. So, again, if a person's in workplace compares to his neighbours, sees he's getting paid more, the judiciary at the end of the day can say, increase the pay. Now, look, what sort of criteria can these, for example, woman-dominated industries, how do they compare with other industries which are similar but not the same? So what they've got is a criteria: skills, responsibilities, working conditions, degree of effort, and remuneration. What I don't see there is risk. Prison guards to rest home workers. I know which one has more danger in it than the other, and there are arguable points here. So I'm not sure that small criteria that we've got on the screen here now is enough, but time will tell. And of course, we're following Britain, who've already adopted this piece of law. All right. So what do we got next? This is the equal pay. As I say, the national government introduced a bill. It was scrapped. Jacinda asked for a new bill, and it's just been released last week. So that's what this slide's really telling us, and it tells you a bit more about what I've just walked through. Now, there's another bill which is drafted. I think it's going through its second reading now, and so it's very close to coming into being. Now, this really will empower unions. This is the amendment to the Employment Relations Act. So what that is reintroducing a lot of changes that the National Party took out, bringing them back in. But what it will be doing is empowering the unions quite significantly. For example, unions, if they give notice to an employer, the employer can't stop them coming in, provided they give reasonable notice. I think it's 14 days. We're coming in onto the property to talk to your staff. That's got to happen. And the employer can't stop them. So it will be difficult for smaller employers who may be on private property or in their homes, and the union can walk in the door after giving due notice. Yep, that's probably going to concern some smaller employers. Now, the other factor is partial strikes. Now, this law is going to change it to say that workers will be paid for partial strikes. What does that mean? Well, if a worker goes on a go-slow, or perhaps doesn't do all the work, overtime bans, those sort of things, the legislation is going to be changed to say the employer's got to pay them. Now, it's been suggested that the workers maybe go to work, go to the tea room, and then refuse to go out into the plant to do the work, and will demand full pay. Now, that's a very powerful weapon for workers to use, because how long could an employer sustain that? A couple of weeks of the workers just sitting in the tea room? Well, who knows? But that's paid for partial strikes. It could be quite concerning. Now, the other one very much concerning for a lot of employers is being forced into collective bargaining. So what this legislation will enable the unions to do is to go around and go, yes, we think that employer should be in collective bargaining, and just name you and name the employer, and they have to step into the bargaining ring. And, well, what happens? If the parties don't come to conclusion, well, the judiciary could decide on what's fair rate of pay. It could do. It could be strikes. All sorts of factors come into being. But employers won't have a choice. They will be forced to go into collective bargaining. The other factor is if there is a union delegate, a representative on site, who does their job normally every day, but they engage in union activity, the employer is forced to pay them. So if they might decide to put down their tools and go off and go over and talk to Jack, or perhaps have a little huddle in a corner, again regarding some grievances they may have, well, the employer's got to pay them. If there's meetings, those sort of factors. So that's where another thing, they'll be forced to pay them for those things. The other factor is if there's negotiations going on, there's a lot of meetings. And it gets to a point, been involved with many of these, gets to a point where you've actually done your arguments and you're starting to repeat them, and you go round and round and round. And meeting again and again and again gets rather tedious because you're actually repeating what you've already said. And but however, this law insists that employers keep meeting with the union and going through it. And it has to, in the law, will be saying the parties have to try and pursue and find agreement between themselves. If not, it can be taken to the judiciary to decide. Minimum rates of pay will be published. Some employers will be concerned about that because, that may be where they've got their edge over their competitor. Who knows? But it's the minimum rates of pay. Not all rates of pay as it originally was then. So that's some good news. So that piece of law, I would think, will be out the next few months and will become law very soon. More to this bill, which is coming through, as I say, will be powered soon. The employers will have to, any new employee that comes into the workplace, they have to promote the union. So they have to give them promotional material and tell them what rights they have in terms of their first 30 days at work. They will be covered by a collective agreement if there's one on the workplace, and then there is promotional material given to them, encouraging them to belong to the union. Some employers are philosophically against this, but of course they won't have a choice. It's law. They'll be forced to do it. The new law also says that if there's cleaning contractors in the workplace where, for example, cleaning or food industry, so if in fact there's been a change where they've decided that the previous cleaner, a good example is a school, so the previous cleaner wasn't doing a good enough job. So the trustees decide we'll get a new contractor in place. This new law will tell the new contractor, if they win the contract, they have to employ the previous cleaning staff. They have to. Irrespective if their quality of work wasn't good enough, they're forced into actually employing them. So that's coming back again. It has been in place before, and it caused a lot of angst and a lot of difficulties for some employers because the quality of work wasn't there with those new employees they had. So, what happens is they end up employing them as they have to under law, and then going through redundancy processes, and which is just, I can't understand this personally, but that's the way the law is. And what it says, it's some lovely words around it. It's protecting the vulnerable workers. So, and it's difficult for workers to be engaged by reluctant employers. The other factor is that if there's a personal grievance and the employer loses the case, reinstatement's going to be back as the primary remedy. It means that worker will go back into the workplace. Again, that's a bit of concern because some of the decisions that come out of them, particularly the Employment Relations Authority, are concerning in terms of where the justice was. So we may find a lot of decisions may be taken further to the court to see whether those decisions are right. And of course, as I mentioned before, the judiciary is going to be very, very busy. And this is another reason to be doing it. The 90-day trial period, we've already seen Winston Peters' influence on that. What the compromise has been is that it will no longer be available to big employers, but it is available to small employers. Statistics are really interesting here. There's a lot of personal grievances associated with the 90-day trial period, and the courts have identified many fishhooks in it. Employers get it wrong frequently. If you look at the statistics and the personal grievances that are coming through, most of them are small employers who fail. I don't even know the facts or figures, but I would say it's a huge proportion of small employers have got the dismissals wrong under a 90-day trial period that have been challenged. So they don't get it right anyway, and they're the most ones who get it wrong, and the legislation itself should be looked at in terms of the wording to enable the parties to do it more comfortably if it's going to happen, if it's going to be retained. And obviously it's going to be, but it's only for those employees, and as I say, 97% of our enterprises in New Zealand have under 20 staff. That 97% will have access to the 90-day trial period. So it's only the big guys, and they will have HR staff, professional staff anyway. So they will walk through the regime as they have to if they're dissatisfied with an employee. Okay, now, as I mentioned before, it's been the last 20 odd years. I've seen it around. Employers have been making their employees redundant and engaging contractors. Would you believe it? Sometimes they're the same workers. So they'll make them redundant, then re-engage them back as contractors. Why? Because that devoids them of the employment laws. Employment laws are already deemed to be harsh and difficult for employers to navigate. I would suggest these 6 pieces of legislation are going to encourage them more to do this. However, the government's seen this, and what are they going to do? They're going to give contractors or dependent contractors the right of protection, employment protections. This bill's not drafted yet, But that's what the government, this is what the Labor Party has signalled. That's what their intention is to do. And it's UK's already got this in. Now, there's a complete different category they've created of contractor. They call it a dependent contractor. So a contractor who is dependent on the employer or the hosting business to make a living. Now, there'll be some definitions on that, which will probably come through. As I say, this is not drafted yet. But that's the indications we're receiving so far. Dependent contractors. That will... I've worked in Auckland City Council, the ADHBs. They all have, where even the receptionists, HR people are contractors. And they're trying to, obviously, the government departments find it difficult navigating employment law. So they've been taking up on this contractor opportunity. Well, it's all about to change. So I'm not predicting this will come out this year. I might be wrong, but it definitely will be probably in place by next year. So that's what's indicated at this stage. We don't have any dates. I'm just speculating at this point in time. But that will have quite a dramatic effect, because I've always said that this nation is becoming a nation of contractors. Mum and dads have been laid off for redundancy, then they're going out to contract back into the workplace again, and to be picked up by some of these larger employers or wherever they can, or the small employers. Well, that could all well change again, and we're forced into actually treating them as employees. So they're interesting, so something to watch this space, but the government have not hedged away. This is where they're looking at doing it. And as I say, it's going to have a big effect on the workplaces around the place at the moment, including the big ones. The big ones are the biggest ones for engaging contractors. So I think they would have to review all their workings and how they engage staff. All right. There's a lot of changes, 6 pieces of legislation. I would suggest that the face of employment is about to change dramatically. And employees, I think you're going to find employers are going to they're going to move with what's natural to them, not to have employees. How else can they do the work? I would think they'll be either shipping it offshore to get done. Already, administration work's getting done offshore by many organisations. Small employers are doing it. We're seeing it all the time, where they're doing their invoicing, they're doing all sorts of work. Of course, automating it's going to happen. We're seeing that already, and the predictions are out of the schools. What we saw in the past in regards to jobs is going to change. I think this legislation is actually going to encourage it to speed up even more. If every employee retained their job out there, the cost of employing them is going to escalate quite a lot, I would think, over a period of time. Where's that money going to come from? Well, the employers are going to they're in business, they're going to have to increase their costs. Who ends up paying? Us. So I would think that we're going to see costs go up. We're going to see our productivity probably dropping off, because some of these changes are going to affect the flexibility that we currently see. The collective bargaining, we talk about one pay rate for everybody. All those terms and conditions will be could well be adjusted where we're already seeing it. The meal breaks, for example, in a piece of law there, I haven't spoken about this, but they're making it mandatory when people take breaks and when they have meal breaks. And they won't be there to suit the needs of the business or the customers. It'll be there because the government have told employers when to let their staff have tea breaks. We're going to see hours of work be less flexible, and a lot of things like that's going to happen. So I think our productivity in New Zealand's not going to be there. Okay, the next point I'm going to talk about now is triangular employment relationships. What that is where an organisation engages or gets a temping agency to bring in staff as they need it. So it's very helpful if there's a lumpy bit in the work. For example, there's 2 major containers needed to be filled because it needs to get offshore in 2 weeks. You haven't got the staff to do it, so you ring up the temping agency, they'll send around 5-10 guys. That's fine, and they come around and do it. However, this piece of law is saying that they'll be the temping agency and the hosting company will be recognised as the employers. So those workers could be covered by the collective on site, and those workers also both parties will be deemed employers. So not only the temping agency is the employer, which is legitimate employer, but also the hosting company will be deemed the employer, and personal grievances could be taken against both those parties. And that's going to be, I'd say, some complications in place for that. But this piece of law is probably there for the right reasons, because there are times where a worker in the workplace in a hosting company is abused and treated poorly and then suddenly told to leave. There's no consequences for that employer. There's no rights of personal grievance for that employer, for the worker to take a personal grievance against the hosting company. The only people they can take a personal grievance against is the agency, and the agency didn't do the abusing, so they're clean. I've had a employee come to me saying, I was getting sexually harassed, something that was pretty offensive, I've got to say, and dramatically. So, and it was in a government department, and they notified the hosting company managers, hey, I've been sexually harassed. Guess what? 2 days later, she was asked to leave. She was asked to leave. I don't believe there was even an investigation of it. So she lost her job. She came to me and said, what can I do? Who can I go to file for an unjustified dismissal? I said, nobody, because the law doesn't enable it. She can't sue the agency, the temp agency, who is her employer, because they didn't do it. And the other agency, they can't. So there is some need for this piece of law. However, it needs to be a lot better than it is. I mean, demanding people be party to collective agreements and those sort of factors can be pretty harsh. And also holding an agency responsible for the behaviour of the hosting company also is a bit harsh. So I believe that the first reading has been done, submissions have been put in, and we put a submission in, and that where indications are that could be under review. So hopefully that is. But that's the contractor piece of legislation we've seen coming through. All right, now let's summarise things. The changes afoot are going to have dramatic effects. There's no argument. If you've got employees in the workplace or you are an employee, the employees are going to enjoy a good hefty wage rise. And there will be opportunities for them to challenge the pay rates constantly, I would think, all the time. The earnings envy revolution will take effect where people could actually say, he's earning more or she's earning more, I want mine. And so there will be increases. Productivity will be probably compromised on the basis of the flexibilities that are in place at the now, where each workplace has an individual way of working and the hours of work, the way they work the workplace, having temps in when they needed them. Those things could all dry up, whereupon they don't have that flexibility, and the cost of actually producing goods is going to be greater. I would suggest we're going to see a lot of work sent offshore to be done. Employers will dodge this bullet. How? By actually contracting the work out offshore. They can do it, and it'll avoid the contractors' laws as well. Already we've seen a lot of, particularly small employers, are getting all their administration done offshore, not by anyone internally. And of course, the accountancy software now is pretty smart, and it could be managed by people offshore. So that's being done cheaper and quicker, and more effectively. I think we're going to see more of that. And of course, that means less jobs in those particular areas. We're seeing automation. We're seeing, for example, as I mentioned, the accountants are quite concerned in regards to what's happening for the future. The fundamentals of accountancy is now becoming automated. So they're now more strategic type accountancy work's being done. That's going to cut jobs. No argument with that. So we're going to see automated, we're going to see robotics, those sort of things coming in place. Why? Because employment's too difficult. It's too difficult because of a lot of the changes. We're going to see if any employer can contract things out, they will do it. They will do it to avoid having employees. I think the identity of an employee is going to become slimmer and less than it was, and the numbers will drop. And we're going to see, people starting their own businesses more and more and more. And we're becoming a nation of contractors, and that's probably going to continue, and I think escalate, particularly with these harsh employment laws coming into being. Now, they're coming into being because the unions say they need it, and because employees are not being treated right. So there's arguments both sides on this. I think we're going to see New Zealand's productivity drop off. We're probably going to see the economy affected, and we're going to see costs of living going up. This is not going to happen overnight. It'll take a number of years, but these factors will have a particular impact on our society. Is it for good? There's no doubt about it. We needed an increase in wages. There's no doubt about it. People were underpaid. But is this going a step too far? Is it possible that perhaps, people could take advantage of some of these laws and actually exploit them for their own betterment? It's highly possible. Anyway, that's Max Whitehead with your summary of employment law in October 2018.